On the 4th of February 1992, a resigned-looking army commander named Hugo Chavez appeared on live television in Venezuela. His message was simple: the attempted military coup he had launched earlier that day, and which had left dozens dead and wounded across the capital Caracas, had failed. His men should lay down their arms. It was not the end for Chavez, though. Almost exactly 7 years later, in February 1999, he entered office as president of Venezuela, touting himself as a revolutionary socialist. How did Chavez go from failed coup leader in 1992 to become the president of Venezuela 7 years later? This is the story of Hugo Chavez, the man who sowed the destruction of modern Venezuela. The man known to history as Hugo Chavez was born on the 28th of July 1954 in the town of Sabaneta, in the state of Barinas in western Venezuela. His father was Hugo de los Reyes Chavez, a schoolteacher, and his mother was Elena Frias de Chavez, who also taught intermittently in a local school. Elena was the granddaughter of Pedro Pérez Delgado, a Venezuelan military officer who later became a rebel in the 1910s and who died in prison in 1924. Hugo Sr. and Elena married when they were teenagers and had 7 children, all boys, one of whom died in infancy. Hugo was the second oldest. The family is of mixed ethnicity, with traces of Spanish, Italian, African, and native heritage. This is not uncommon in Latin America, owing to Spanish intermarriage with the native people of South and Central America in colonial times. Chávez's political career, and especially the rhetoric of his ideology, cannot be understood without looking backwards to long before he was born. Venezuela's proximity to the Caribbean meant that it was one of the first parts of the American mainland that the Spanish made contact with after they secured a foothold in the Caribbean in the 1490s. Colonial development here was slow, as the discovery of silver in Bolivia, Mexico, and Peru pulled the center of Spanish colonial gravity elsewhere. Caracas was not founded until 1567. Things changed in the 17th and 18th centuries as cocoa became a cash crop that was grown in Venezuela at scale. The augmented wealth of the region meant that a Captaincy General of Venezuela was established in 1777 by the Spanish. This administrative zone was the basis for Venezuelan nationhood when rebellions against Spanish rule spread across Latin America at the start of the 1810s. The main leader of the revolt in Venezuela, and later to the west in Colombia and Peru, was Simón Bolívar, a military officer born in Caracas in 1783. Venezuela was one of several nations that emerged after the collapse of Gran Colombia at the start of the 1830s. It remained a poor country for decades until the discovery of large oil reserves in the country in 1908 began to alter its circumstances marginally. However, like many other Latin American nations, Venezuela was dominated by an elite of large landowners, while elections were hardly ever free and fair. After the Second World War, a coup in 1948 brought a military junta to power. It was dominated by Marcos Pérez Jiménez until another coup in 1958 led to the Punto Fijo Pact, an agreement through which democracy was re-established in Venezuela. Hence, where most Latin American nations were heading into a period of coups and military juntas in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, Venezuela's experiment with military rule had already taken place between 1948 and 1958. Still, Chavez would grow up to become a bitter opponent of the system established through the Punto Fijo Pact. The Chavez family were very poor. They initially lived in a modest house in the countryside near Sabaneta. The roof of their home was partially constructed of palm leaves, and the rooms had plain dirt floors. It was a small space for the 8 members of the family. As he grew up, his parents encouraged him to prioritize his education, while his mother wished for him to join the priesthood and coerced Hugo into becoming an altar boy. It did not exactly have the desired effect. Chavez developed some critical views of elements of the church, although he was never an atheistic socialist in later life, and he skillfully utilized Christianity as a method of building support for his regime in an intensely Catholic country. The family moved and split up as Hugo grew up out of a desire to escape the confines of their small abode. Hugo and his older brother, Adan, were sent to live with their grandparents, who had a home in the town of Sabaneta itself. Later, their parents and the rest of the family moved into town as well, after acquiring a home there. Hugo was then sent to the city of Barinas to attend Daniel Florencio O'Leary School. It was through the influence of a friend here, whose father, José Ruiz, was a prominent Venezuelan Marxist, that Hugo was first introduced to texts outlining communist ideas. While he was growing up as a teenager, Rafael Caldera became president of Venezuela in 1969. He was a critical figure in the fostering of democracy in the country after the era of the military junta. He would also play a controversial role in Chávez's rise to power in the 1990s. When he was 17 years old, Hugo headed for Caracas to enroll in the Venezuelan Academy of Military Sciences. There he became a keen admirer of both Simón Bolívar, the great hero of the independence movement from Spanish colonial rule across South America, and also Ernesto Che Guevara, the Argentine doctor who had subsequently become a Marxist-Leninist revolutionary and who was the key figure in the military victories of the Cuban Revolution in the winter of 1958 that brought Fidel Castro to power on the Caribbean island. More immediately, he took inspiration from Juan Velasco Alvarado, the military dictator of Peru between 1968 and 1975. Unlike most of the military dictators that rose to power across the continent in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, Alvarado favored left-leaning socio-economic policies in Peru. His platform there influenced Chávez's later actions, as did that of Juan Perón in Argentina in the post-war period, or indeed Omar Torrijos, a left-leaning military leader of Panama who controlled the country between 1968 and 1981. In 1974, Chávez briefly met Alvarado in Peru, after he was sent there as part of a military delegation to mark the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Ayacucho, the last major battle of the Spanish-American Wars of Independence. It secured Peru's independence from Spain and ensured that Gran Colombia, including Venezuela, would also remain independent. 7 months later, in the summer of 1975, Chávez graduated from the military academy just before he turned 21 years old and was commissioned as a sub-lieutenant. Chávez spent the next 17 years as a rising officer in the Venezuelan military. Venezuela did not fight a major war between 1975 and 1992, but it was dealing with a guerrilla insurgency by the Red Flag Party, a communist movement that adhered to the socialist platform of Enver Hoxha, the Marxist dictator of Albania. In 1976, Chávez was given command of a unit charged with suppressing parts of their revolt in the vast jungles and mountainous terrain of Venezuela. He married for the first time in 1977. His wife was Nancy Colmenares, a woman who hailed from Sabaneta as well. They had 3 children together, 2 daughters, Rosa and Maria, and a son, Hugo Jr. As he was beginning his family and rising to become a mid-ranking officer at the military academy in Caracas by the early 1980s, Chávez's political views were becoming more radical, and in 1982 He was one of several military officers with left-leaning views who clandestinely formed what they called the Movimiento Bolivariano Revolucionario, or Revolutionary Bolivarian Movement, in honor of Simón Bolívar. They added the suffix 200 to the name a year later to mark the 200th anniversary of the birth of Bolívar. As the 1980s went on, the group recruited more officers, while Chávez's socialist ideas changed under the influence of his mistress between 1983 and 1992, Herma Marxman, a historian who would later repudiate her relationship with Hugo and claim that he became utterly corrupted by power in the 2000s. Meanwhile, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Revolutionary Bolivarian movement gained traction among around 10% of the Venezuelan military's officer class as the country's economic situation deteriorated. Venezuela had benefited immensely from the oil shock of 1973 and the quadrupling of global oil prices that ensued. In the 1980s, though, mismanagement of the economy and rising inflation and debt necessitated a $4.6 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund in 1989. As these events played out, Chávez and his fellow revolutionary Bolivarians were waiting and planning a military coup when the opportune moment arose. Chávez's rise to power in the 1990s was an extraordinary series of events. In 1992, he was at the center of not one, but two different coups. The loan from the IMF in 1989 came with provisions for sweeping cuts to public spending and services. When Carlos Andrés Pérez entered office as president in February, he began implementing this package of measures, leading to riots throughout the country that necessitated the imposition of martial law. It was at this juncture that Chávez and his Bolivarian allies stepped up their planning for a military coup. They had hoped to launch it in 1991, although in the end it was the 4th of February 1992 before the insurrection occurred. The plan only ever involved a subsection of the military with collaborators within civilian society. Chávez led one unit that seized control of the military museum in Caracas, while other divisions moved to secure further key locations. The coup failed, as the unit that headed for the Miraflores Palace in the capital to capture President Pérez was fired upon as they approached the palace. Someone had evidently revealed details of the plot. Owing to this, Pérez remained at large, and the Bolivarians failed to seize control of the government. Chávez and his men in the military museum subsequently surrendered, and his famous television appearance ensued, in which he ordered his followers to lay down their arms, though Chávez signed off with the famous statement that the attempted revolution had failed por ahora, meaning for now. The coup of February 1992 brought an end to Chávez's military career. He was imprisoned at a military detention center in San Carlos. His affair with Marxman ended at that stage, and what remained of his marriage was also ending. He and Nancy officially divorced in 1995. While Hugo was in prison, he became the figurehead of a second coup, when a cohort of his followers tried to seize power for a second time on the 27th of November 1992. This second coup was actually initiated more successfully than the one 10 months earlier, and the revolutionary Bolivarians secured control over numerous media buildings and military bases before the revolt was suppressed that evening after heavy fighting. They failed to rescue Chávez from prison. The second attempted coup was a sign of how deeply unpopular Pérez's government was, and in May 1993 he was impeached by the Supreme Court on charges of stealing millions of dollars worth of public money in the midst of an economic emergency. Fresh elections led to the election of Rafael Caldera, amongst whose campaign promises was a commitment to releasing Chávez and the other imprisoned revolutionary Bolivarians. Thus, in December 1994, Hugo was released. Despite the seemingly close relationship with Caldera, who may have been involved in the planning for the coup of February 1992, Chavez immediately left Venezuela after he was released and spent the next 2 years traveling around Latin America to drum up support in Cuba, Argentina, Chile, and elsewhere for a potential revolt back in his homeland. However, events would lead in another direction. The continued presence of the IMF in Venezuela and further shocks to the economy from the 1997 Asian financial crisis meant that Caldera and the establishment political parties were increasingly out of favor. Thus, in 1997, the Fifth Republic movement was formed as a political successor to the revolutionary Bolivarian movement. When presidential elections came due again in 1998, Chavez stood as a candidate and comfortably defeated his closest rival, Enrique Salas Romer, after running on an anti-corruption and poverty relief platform. Thus, on the 2nd of February 1999, 2 days before the 7th anniversary of the 1992 coup, Hugo Chavez became the 52nd president of Venezuela. Chavez began his presidency with sweeping reforms, ostensibly designed to overhaul the culture of corruption within government and society. He basically removed the Congress and the Supreme Court and replaced it with a new assembly of his supporters from within the Bolivarian movement. A very long and detailed constitution was also drafted, and it was adopted later that year to replace a constitution created in 1961 in the aftermath of the military junta. Beyond this, Chavez was initially constrained in what he could do, as international oil prices were at their lowest points since before the 1973 oil shock, owing to the fallout from the 1997 Asian financial crisis. When he entered office, a barrel of oil was around $25 on the international market. This meant that Chavez initially had to adopt a market-orientated economic approach, and the Plan Bolivar 2000, which his government initiated soon after entering power, was more about immediate poverty relief rather than completely overhauling the Venezuelan economy. When oil prices recovered, Chavez was able to become more ambitious. In 2003, the Bolivarian missions were set up. These were over 30 programs in the spheres such as education, healthcare, and housing, which used Venezuela's oil revenue to invest in state-run services and construction. Two things need to be kept in mind here. Despite its long-standing oil industry, Venezuela was a highly unequal society, where between 40% and 50% of people lived in poverty when Chavez came to power in 1999. Secondly, while the Chavistas, as he and his followers would become known over time, subsequently became even more corrupt than previous Venezuelan administrations, in their earliest years in power, there was a genuine investment in overhauling elements of Venezuelan society that can be measured in real metrics. Before any of that happened, Chavez was nearly ousted from power in a coup in April 2002. Fresh elections had been held in 2000, and Chavez had been re-elected as president with 60% of the vote, which, under the new constitution, meant that he would hold power for 6 years. This extended term, along with the bypassing of parliament to rule by decree, was already leading to charges of corruption and nepotism. A broad coalition of more conservative elements within the military, church, and business sector formed a strong opposition movement which pushed to curtail the authoritarian creep under Chavez. They were even joined by some of the trade unions after Chavez interfered with the composition of the board of Petróleos de Venezuela, the state oil company which had run the oil industry under semi-national control since 1976. Albeit operating with aid from Chevron, ExxonMobil, and other international oil behemoths. Tension built between the 7th and 11th of April. On the 11th, it turned into a full-scale coup, as opponents of the regime installed the economist and businessman Pedro Carmona as an interim president and began reversing the Bolivarian reforms. Chavez was detained and briefly removed from power for all of 47 hours. Then, in a sign of the significant popularity he had in the 2000s, there was a public outcry which led to the coup collapsing on the 13th, and Chavez reclaiming power. He faced a recall referendum in 2004, so the coup of 2002 was not the last threat to his rule. Nonetheless, thereafter he solidified his grip. Chavez won re-election in 2006 for another 6 years. It is unquestionable that there was electoral fraud in 2006, as the electoral register had grown in the years prior to it in ways that indicate voters were being invented by the government. Yet studies of that election suggest that Chavez, who claimed 63% of the vote officially, might have won it even without the fraudulent manipulation of the result by the Bolivarians. That Chavez might have actually obtained more real votes than his opponent, Manuel Rosales, in the 2006 election was owing to the success of the Bolivarian missions in the mid-2000s. There is no doubt that the Chavistas destroyed the Venezuelan economy in the long run. On the other hand, the data also makes clear that the Bolivarian missions were briefly successful in initiating social and economic reform in the country. Massive investment of oil revenue led to new schools and hospitals being built, and the stock of social housing swelled. Primary education became almost universal. Enrollment in secondary education went from under half of Venezuelans to over 70%. 1.5 million previously illiterate people were taught to read and write in the mid-2000s, and university attendance scaled upwards. Thousands of local medical centers were set up in small communities to improve healthcare access, and doctors were brought in from Cuba, with whom Chavez had formed a close alliance, to work in these. 300 hospitals were either built or substantially modernized. Average life expectancies continued to tick upwards to around 73 years. Later in his tenure, Chavez launched Gran Misión Housing Venezuela, which aimed to build several million homes, although this was less successful, and the escalating levels of corruption within the Chavista movement meant that more of the money allocated for these programs was being stolen than spent on what it was earmarked for. Nonetheless, all of the objective international studies agree that the number of people living in extreme poverty in Venezuela fell considerably in the 2000s, from nearly 50% of the population to below 30%. The longer he remained in power, the more influential Chavez became across Latin America. His election in 1998 was part of what is termed the pink tide. This was a phenomenon that is still underway in the 2020s to a degree. It began in the 1990s after the end of the Cold War, and in reaction to the right-wing military juntas that came to power and then fell in countries like Brazil, Argentina, and Chile in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. The pink tide was a term used to describe the rise to power of center-left governments across the region in countries like Venezuela, Colombia, Mexico, Brazil, and Bolivia. Pink refers to these left-wing movements as being perceived as less radical than the red communist or Marxist parties that opposed the military juntas in these countries during the Cold War. Chavez was a key ideological leader in the rise of the pink tide. He formed a very close alliance with Fidel Castro's Cuba, and together they initiated the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America, an international movement which sought to promote cooperation between left-wing governments in Latin America and the Caribbean. There were many left-wing candidates who Chavez supported that were elected in the 2000s, notably Luis Inácio Lula da Silva in Brazil in 2003 and Evo Morales in Bolivia in 2006. The pink tide also spread to Mexico in the 2010s. In tandem, Chavez became an advocate of socialism of the 21st century, a revisionist form of Marxism that rejected certain elements of the authoritarianism of 20th century communism and the excessively ideological approach towards socialism. Through all of these measures, along with his role in the non-aligned movement, Chavez became an important individual within Latin American and global politics in the 2000s. His relations with the US declined precipitously in tandem, especially so after Chavez completely nationalized the oil industry in 2007 and expropriated the assets of US oil firms like Chevron and ExxonMobil. Chavez's promotion of left-wing politics throughout Latin America created friction as well. This was close to home and occurred in 2008, an event known as the Andean Crisis. Venezuela's western neighbor, Colombia, had been mired in an asymmetric civil war since 1964 between the left-wing Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, or FARC, guerrillas, and a succession of right-wing governments. This conflict was a complex one with multiple layers of combatants, including narcotics cartels based out of cities like Medellin. On the 1st of March 2008, the Colombian government sent troops over the border into Ecuador to pursue FARC rebels there. This happened to come only a year after a left-leaning ally of Chavez, Rafael Correa, had become president of Ecuador. In response, both Correa and Chavez ordered troops to their respective borders with Colombia, and a tense standoff ensued over the next week. Chavez engaged in incendiary rhetoric during these days, claiming that the Colombian president Álvaro Uribe was a stooge of American imperialism in South America. In response, the Colombian government claimed it had retrieved material from FARC laptops and hard drives, which showed Chavez had been providing support to the rebels in Colombia ever since he became president. A de-escalation occurred on the 7th of March during meetings of the Rio Group of Latin American statesmen, and Colombia issued an apology to the Ecuadorian government for the incursion. While this prevented the military buildup at the borders from turning into a regional war, Chavez continued to provide clandestine support to the FARC guerrillas. A complaint by Colombia in 2010 led to Chavez cutting off diplomatic ties with Venezuela's western neighbors, exposing the limitations of his championing of the pink tide across Latin America. Chavez was a colorful leader, to say the least. He cultivated friendships with famous people throughout Latin America, most notably the troubled legend of Argentinian football Diego Maradona. It seems fair to say that Chavez could be charming in a way, and commanded personal loyalty. But he was also extremely moody, and many close to him suspected he suffered from depression or was bipolar. He remained a contrarian Catholic throughout his life, and publicly stated that he was not an adherent of Maria Leonza, a peculiar modern Venezuelan religion that mixes elements of Christianity and native and West African religious beliefs. Despite this, many continued to claim that Chavez was a devotee. In the 2000s, he was involved in the publication of several biographical books, among which was a text based on interviews of Chavez by Elena Guevara, the daughter of Che Guevara. Hugo's family also benefited in vast ways from his ascent. Many of his extended family members obtained political offices of one kind or another. His own family grew too. In 1997, he married his second wife, a journalist named Marisabel Rodriguez de Chavez, with whom he had a daughter named Rosines in 1997. He and Marisabel separated in 2002 and divorced 2 years later. Chavez's constant affairs contributed to their separation, and he fathered numerous illegitimate children. How many is unclear, as there were instances where he refused to acknowledge the paternity of those who claimed he was their father. Stories of Chávez's peculiar behavior and statements abounded as his tenure as president went on. For instance, in 2010, he ordered that the remains of his idol Simón Bolívar should be exhumed and his bones examined to test out Chávez's theory that Bolívar had been poisoned as part of a conspiracy or possibly assassinated. Historians universally agree that Bolívar died from tuberculosis in 1830, and there is no evidence at all to support Chávez's theory. Nevertheless, Bolívar's remains were removed from their tomb in Caracas and examined before being reinterred. Between 1999 and 2012, Chávez appeared in hundreds of episodes of Aló Presidente, a talk show that was broadcast in Venezuela to promote him and his regime, yet which international observers noted looked like a strange parody of government propaganda. During it, Chávez would break into song, take phone calls live on air, and descend into rambling stories. His strangest moments were reserved for his attacks on the United States. He referred to George Bush Jr. as the devil, while in 2011 he presented a bizarre theory in which he asserted that capitalism had wiped out life on the planet Mars. In a 2005 episode of Aló Presidente, he had indicated his plan to prohibit the celebration of Halloween in Venezuela, as it too was a form of imperialist terror. He was an avid Twitter user after joining the platform in 2010, and in the summer of 2012 gave an apartment to a woman in recognition of her becoming his 3 millionth follower. These were just a few of his more eccentric actions during 14 years in charge of Venezuela. Those who defend Chávez's reign as head of the Venezuelan state today after his death frequently do so by inferring that he is not to blame for the gross levels of corruption and incompetence that developed in the Venezuelan government after Nicolás Maduro succeeded him. While Maduro's reign certainly created an unprecedented crisis, Chávez was every bit as much of a kleptocrat, a ruler who views the state primarily through the lens of what can be stolen from it. By the early 2000s, there was already a system in place whereby officials within the government could manipulate the high price of oil and the exchange rate between US dollars and the Bolívar, the Venezuelan currency, to benefit themselves. As the years went by, endemic corruption in everything from the distribution of state contracts to the sale of passports for thousands of dollars per document developed. Across Chávez's tenure, roughly $1/3 trillion of state money was misplaced, although that is an estimate and the true figure can never be fully known. Chávez and his family personally benefited, and reports claimed that his daughter Maria had more than $4 billion stashed away in foreign banks by 2015. Other investigations revealed a bizarre deal whereby Chávez supplied the Belarusian government of dictator Alexander Lukashenko with $1.4 billion worth of oil and never received any official payment. Presumably, payments were made to Chávez and leading officials in Venezuela. By the end of the 2000s, Venezuela had become one of the most corrupt countries in the world, with theft of state assets and bribery built into the system at every level, although it must be kept in mind that it was a country with a long culture of political corruption. The full extent of the damage would only become clear after Chávez's rule, for the simple reason that throughout a large part of his tenure as president, Venezuela was making so much money from oil sales that the wealth trickled down into society and disguised the worst effects of the corruption. There should be no doubt, though, that Chávez oversaw the creation of this kleptocracy with the Chavista regime. This corruption did not plunge Venezuela into crisis in the 2000s. As long as oil revenue remained high, there was always enough money to pay for investment in large state-financed apartment blocks, schools, universities, and hospitals. People were relatively happy with Chávez's government. Then the fundamental financial dynamics on which the whole system was built collapsed. oil prices peaked in the summer of 2008, briefly reached over $140 a barrel as the housing and financial bubble of the 2000s swelled across the Western world, before promptly exploding that September with the collapse of Lehman Brothers in New York. In December 2008, the price of a barrel of oil on the international markets briefly plunged as low as $36. Although it swiftly recovered, prices averaged around $50 a barrel through 2009. They recovered substantially after that, but the 2010s were a tumultuous decade for energy prices. Between 2014 and 2016, for example, Saudi Arabia led a war by OPEC against the US shale oil industry, whereby they flooded the market with Middle Eastern oil in an attempt to put the American producers out of business, as shale can only be produced if it sells for a high enough price, as the cost of producing it is much more expensive than crude oil. At one point in early 2016, oil prices plunged down close to $30 a barrel. The insecurity of the oil market would have devastating consequences for Venezuela. The first signs were already apparent in 2009, as Chavez cut public spending commitments. Chavez would not live to see the system he had built implode fully. On the 30th of June 2011, he appeared on television from Havana in Cuba. In this broadcast, during which he was noticeably thinner and pale-looking, he announced that a large tumor had been removed from around his pelvic region. To date, the type of cancer that Chavez had developed has never been officially revealed. It is assumed that it was colorectal cancer, which was then aggravated by substantial respiratory problems as he received chemotherapy at intervals over the next year and a half. After initial treatment, Chavez returned to Caracas to campaign in the next presidential elections. On the 7th of October 2012, he won a fresh 6-year term after defeating Enrique Capriles in an election where Chavez won 55% of the vote. Had it been a free and fair election, Chavez might have fallen from power in 2012. A temporary resurgence in the price of oil between late 2010 through to 2013 meant that Chavez remained popular with a lot of Venezuelans. Whether he could have won the election if there had not been manipulation of the electoral roll and other tactics deployed is debatable, though. It would not be a long fourth term in any event. Although Chavez had declared that he was cancer-free on the campaign trail, within a few weeks of his re-election, he stated that he would be returning to Havana shortly for further treatment. Behind the scenes, lots of scheming was underway to see who might succeed him. One candidate was Diosdado Cabello, a prominent figure throughout Chavez's time as president. He had played a role in suppressing the coup of 2002 and held numerous ministerial positions. In a strange development, though, when Chavez was re-elected in October 2012, he appointed Nicolás Maduro, a former bus driver who had risen swiftly through the ranks of the administration in the 2000s after becoming a trade union leader and becoming Minister of Foreign Affairs in 2006 as his vice president. While Chavez was in Havana in late 2012 and early 2013, Maduro became the face of the regime in his absence, a sign of who his successor would be. Chavez underwent further surgery in Cuba in December 2012, which led to respiratory complications. He returned to Venezuela in February 2013 amid constantly shifting claims that he was in remission, yet he was not seen in public. Instead, his condition deteriorated drastically, and on the 5th of March 2013, Maduro appeared on state television to announce that he had died in a military hospital in the capital from complications arising from his cancer. Security forces were deployed across the country to maintain control, as riots broke out in several locations. There is a possibility that Chavez was dead before this time. Several defectors from the regime, including Chavez's former bodyguard Liamzi Salazar, have claimed in the years since that Chavez actually died in December 2012, and that the release of the news of his death was delayed until the start of March to secure the regime's position. Afterwards, Maduro assumed office officially as the new president, after barely winning an election against Capriles to confirm his position in April 2013. With a winning margin of less than 250,000 votes, Maduro must have lost the election of 2013 in actuality. 4 days of official mourning, later extended to 11, were announced in March, and Chávez's body lay in state before his funeral on the 17th of March. His remains were laid to rest in the Museo Histórico Militar in Caracas. Venezuela was already in crisis in Chávez's final years owing to mismanagement of the public finances, staggering levels of corruption, and oscillating oil prices. As bad as things were, though, in the early 2010s, they became infinitely worse in the years after Chávez's death. Maduro took the corruption of the Bolivarian government to new heights, even as the country spiraled downwards. There were multiple elements to this. For instance, the oil price collapse brought on by OPEC's war with the US shale oil industry was catastrophic for Venezuela. This was compounded by one of the worst episodes of hyperinflation experienced by any nation in modern history. High levels of inflation are normal for developing nations, and Venezuela had elevated levels in the 1980s and 1990s. Under Chávez, it ticked up, hitting 69% in 2004. Then it ballooned into hyperinflation under Maduro. The most simple explanation for this is that the economic policy pursued by an incredibly corrupt government was completely incompetent. To facilitate their own theft of public resources and to try to quell growing public anger about the economic situation, the Maduro regime began printing more and more money, a recipe for economic disaster. Inflation ballooned up to around 4,000% in 2017, and then onwards to 2,000,000% in 2018 and 2019. Unemployment went from about 15% to over 40% during these years, and supermarkets ran out of the most basic foodstuffs. Unsurprisingly, millions of people began fleeing the country, often walking all the way to Mexico and the United States. Estimates are that between 6 and 8 million people left owing to the crisis. Despite the catastrophic situation, Maduro clung to power for years through a rising authoritarianism. The oil industry ossified as international sanctions limited the nations Venezuela could realistically sell to. Today, after a special operatives mission in which Maduro was captured by the United States and brought to New York to be prosecuted, the husk of the Bolivarian movement theoretically remains in charge in Caracas, but it is hard to know how to even define it at this stage. It is a residual kleptocracy left in charge of a country it devastated, seemingly without a clear goal in mind for the future or any specific ideology. Hugo Chavez was a complex leader of Venezuela, more complex than Nicolás Maduro. Maduro comes across like a man who never had any ideological basis for anything that he did as president of Venezuela beyond enriching himself and the rest of the elite of the corrupt movement Chavez had established. Chavez was different in some ways, at least earlier in his life. He came of age in an era in Latin American history when right-wing military dictators and juntas were seizing power everywhere, generally speaking, supported by the United States, which was anxious to shore up its influence across the Western Hemisphere after the Cuban Revolution had created genuine concerns about the spread of Soviet influence to the Americas. Like many people in Latin America, Chavez drifted to the left politically as a consequence of the general political conditions of the 1960s and 1970s in Venezuela and in countries like Chile, Argentina, and Brazil, while he also developed an antipathy towards the United States. This ideology motivated him throughout his younger years as a military officer, and in 1992 he launched a coup to try to overthrow the government. Remarkably, he was pardoned and released in 1994, and then, after pontificating about a new armed insurrection, he entered electoral politics instead and secured power at the ballot box in 1998. Chávez's Bolivarian Revolution did deliver a lot of improvements to Venezuelan society initially, in terms of the provision of healthcare and increased educational standards. But in the course of the 2000s, the regime he presided over became utterly corrupt. He transformed into a de facto leader for life, and the government shifted towards enormous levels of corruption that Chávez was front and central to. In tandem, his public pronouncements became increasingly strange, and his rhetoric towards the United States was designed increasingly as a smokescreen to disguise the collapse of the Bolivarian social enterprise in Venezuela. Had he not died in 2013, Chávez would have presided over the exact same collapse of Venezuela that Maduro ultimately did. What do you think of Hugo Chávez? Was he a self-serving kleptocrat who was simply luckier in terms of the international economic environment that existed when he was in control of Venezuela? Or was he a fundamentally different person from Maduro, who wreaked devastation in the country after Chávez died? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.